Thank you so much for joining the session. I think it's a real privilege to be able to discuss different elements of securing the core enterprise in a time where cybersecurity is actually capturing the majority of the headlines and is really becoming something that is discussed globally throughout. So thank you for joining. And again, I think it will come to no surprise that the world that we live in is increasingly complex. We're seeing a rapid pace of innovation. We're seeing traditional industries being disrupted and adopting change in a rapid pace. We're seeing practically an economy where everything is getting connected through apps, through end devices, and more through AI solutions that are now becoming practically a commodity within the enterprise, which drives organization to ingest huge amounts of data, including very sensitive data, including PII. And this landscape also tries to make more of what's available to all of us and tries to connect us all. And of course, if we're talking or looking to the next 2-3 years, autonomous cars, even more rapid adoption of AI, all of this brings us to a world that is already very, very complex, and a world in which the regulation and legal landscapes are having a hard time catching up. We are seeing some islands, such as privacy and others, in which regulation is becoming more and more relevant, but still behind the curve a bit. And to all of that came COVID-19 and basically reshuffled everything. Businesses had to basically transform to a survival mode, change their holistic way of perception of risk management, of security management, made them take risks where they wouldn't in any other usual circumstances. And of course, you wouldn't want to be the CIO or CTO that would come to your board and basically highlight that we are not ready for this pandemic. We cannot allow our employees to effectively work remotely. We don't have enough presence online. We don't have our solutions connected. And obviously, again, as I mentioned, this would change the way you're looking at risk and willing to ingest more risk. And this became our new reality. Of course, in the beginning of the pandemic, no one knew would it take 2 months, 3 months, a year. But obviously, what we're seeing more and more is that this is our new reality. It will be so for the foreseeable future. And on top of this, it apparently won't change even after the pandemic leaves us. And the remote everything perception will stay with us, I assume, for a very long time. And this is even relevant for, like I said, very traditional industries. If you take, for example, the FSI industry, financial services that have been very, very traditional, what we're seeing right now is that they had to intake a lot of transformation very quickly. And obviously, you as a consumer right now will not be willing to take anything that's not available immediately, connected, and allows you to do everything you need remotely. So when we're looking about this as an IT challenge, we're seeing that organization had to adapt quickly. They had to roll out new security controls for a new world. And again, sometimes the risk mitigation and the risk management wasn't as strict as we've seen in past years. And on top of that, obviously, the bad actors are not staying idle. They know that the changes that enterprises are ongoing right now open the door for a wider attack surface, open the door to new vulnerabilities and that wasn't there just a year ago. And obviously, this landscape also changes dramatically and connects to what we saw in the past few years as a very troubling time. Okay, the numbers you're seeing on the screen, our digest of numbers that we're seeing from Gartner, from IDC, from other research firms, but basically highlight how significant cyber threats have become to the industry as a whole, and especially for countries that have been reliant on digitization, on transformation, and the more advanced countries are obviously more open to these risks than others. And if we're looking at the security landscape, we're also seeing a rapid change here. We're seeing nation state players taking a much larger role in this landscape. We are seeing a lack of professional skill in this industry, and again, numbers that we've seen in the industry talk about something like 3 million professionals short in the coming 3-4 years. And we are, again, as I said before, looking at the virtually anything attackable kind of landscape. Everything is connected, everything is immediate, and everything is digitized. So the attack surface is much larger than we saw in the past. On top of this, the other part that we're seeing is that the cost of attacks has been reduced significantly compared to anything we've seen in the past. Today, you can practically purchase a 0-day sophisticated attack for as low as $5,000. And this obviously puts a lot of strain on the way organizations should manage their risk and the way we should look at this industry as a whole. Because again, very sophisticated attacks can be procured for almost nothing, especially if you're looking at the landscape in which nation states players are very imminent in, and in which, for example, commercial espionage, which large enterprises can deploy, utilize. So in those areas, when you're looking at the prices that are now shown on the screen, you understand that it's very cheap to conduct a sophisticated attack on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's still very costly to maintain a very secure enterprise. So that's generally the landscape. But as I talked about, one of the key areas we want to deep dive into is supply chain security. And when we're talking about supply chain security, we're talking about scenarios in which attacks target one of your partners, okay, one of your providers, usually software providers, in order to infiltrate your organization or even more so an entire industry. And I think that a good example to that would be a case we saw a few years ago, Ticketmaster, in which through the support chat app that Ticketmaster deployed, an attack was basically routed through the infrastructure of Ticketmaster and enabled the attacker to secure a lot of private information, credit cards, PII, etc. And I think the most imminent example for that was what we just saw with SolarWinds. So if you didn't have a chance to see in the news, practically early in December 8th, FireEye, a very big cybersecurity firm, announced that it detected an attack on its systems in a campaign that was targeted in order to infiltrate organizations and government entities around the world. As the investigation continued, it was obvious that SolarWinds, which is an IT management provider, was the target of that attack, and practically through its solution, or very popular solution called Orion, which was deployed at more than 300,000 customers around the world, it was able to infiltrate networks of over 18,000 customers, many of which were Fortune 500 companies and US government agencies. And what we saw in this particular incident was that through the update mechanism of Orion, again, the IT management software that SolarWinds deployed to many of its customers, through the update mechanism of Orion, the attacker was able to gain access to the end customers of SolarWinds networks and was able to basically very quietly infiltrate the network and create havoc or cause havoc within those networks, gain access, and digest a lot of information and data from those systems. What made it even more complex is that the attack basically used the SolarWinds update mechanism in order to portray a very normal kind of activity that usually we would see from this specific suite, Orion, in our networks, which made it almost impossible to detect that specific attack. Now, obviously, we're short in time, so I won't be able to go into all the details, but this is just an example to a very sophisticated and very relevant supply chain attacks. So we're seeing more and more supply chain attacks in the industry. And if we were asking ourselves why, so I think the main few points that touch that are that, first of all, supply chain attacks allow us to attack a very wide attack surface, right? Because as I mentioned before, we have to penetrate just one firm in order to gain access to multiple end customers. The second thing is that detecting those supply chain attacks is very hard, because again, usually what we as an enterprise would do, we would trust that partner's solution in order to allow us to receive that specific service. And when that solution is compromised, it's very hard to detect. Third, this allows for a very creative attack. Again, those supply chain attacks are very hard to detect, and they can ingest a lot of data from our enterprise without us being concerned that there is any malactivity happening in our infrastructure. The scale, as I mentioned, is very wide and significant, and we are seeing, as I mentioned earlier, many more nation states actors within this landscape. And this creates a very unbalanced playing field, allowing for undeveloped or relatively undeveloped countries such as North Korea, Iran, and others to create havoc and create a very significant damage for very advanced countries, which they cannot, in conventional measures, face with or basically create a level playing field with. So cyber, in that case, is a very efficient attack route. So how do we, as an enterprise, can mitigate supply chain risks? So again, I'm a lawyer, unfortunately, but this practically, the first stage here would be to make sure that we understand the agreement that we have with our customers, with our vendors, and make sure that those agreements include all the risk mitigation factors we need or want. The second thing is, through those agreements, we want to define mandatory level of security and associated controls within the infrastructure of our vendors. And here I would strongly recommend to use industry existing standards in order to do that. SOC would be a great infrastructure to utilize. Third, we need to conduct vendor risk assessment. Okay, the agreement is great, but we need to make sure that our partners actually meet those agreements. So we need to assess their environments as well as we need to do with ours. We need to limit access. Okay, usually we're opening the door to partners. We need to make sure that we are opening the door only to the extent that it is vital to provide the service and not more than that. We need to control the data even when it leaves our organization. There are tools to do that today. Azure Information Protection is a good example. Just one, there are others that allows us to control the data even after it leaves our organization. We need to assume breach all the time. Like I said, no one is bulletproof. Even the biggest cybersecurity firms can be hacked. Even the biggest cloud vendors in the world can be hacked. We need to assume breach all the time and to implement advanced threat intelligence within our organization to allow us rapid detection. Again, key, we need to detect those attacks early on and not to allow them to reside within our networks for months over months, because again, that will create a very high risk portfolio and allow us to use automation to detect those and eventually remediate. And again, detection, investigation, and remediations are probably the strongest things we need to implement within our infrastructure. And I would ask you to go around the industry, see those tools, utilize AI in order to allow you to enjoy automation and the ability to detect those attacks early on. And again, we're slightly short on time. So thank you so much for joining me. Happy to continue the discussion over LinkedIn and stay in touch. So again, thank you for being with us. Have a great day.